Well, in early April, there was a local bird watcher suddenly spotted lots of activity going into one of the areas of the reed bed. He was seeing an adult great white egret going in repeatedly into the same spot, and it looked very much like nest building activity. A few days later, we got together with the RSPB and the Somerset Ornithological Society, and clearly Natural England as well, and decided that it warranted a 24-hour nest operation, because this, if it was successful, was going to be the first nesting attempt by the great white egrets in the UK. So that's what we did, and we managed to get into contact with about 40 willing volunteers who, over the next 4 weeks, went 24-hour wardening from a little caravan just down the track along here, and put in over 1,000 hours of wardening to make sure that nothing untoward came of the nest.
Now, Kevin, the first nest here at Shapwick was very, very successful. And as far as I know, you managed to hatch 3 youngsters and they all successfully fledged. So tell me all about that first nest.
Yes, it did take some time to see what was going on there, because it was so well concealed in the reeds, we couldn't quite see the nest itself. So we're there watching lots and lots of activity of parent birds supposedly going backwards and forwards, but couldn't actually see the chicks. And it was well into May before we got a first glimpse of one of the youngsters probably getting up onto the nest and started to wing stretch. And that was our first hint that we actually had chicks here.
I also understand, Kevin, there were a few alarm bells ringing. There was some exciting activity with that first nest, and I think you've got a couple of stories to tell me.
Just before we saw that chick for the first time, we were still totally unconvinced that we'd got some youngsters in there. Again, we'd seen the adults going backwards and forwards, but we weren't sure whether they were feeding youngsters or whether they were just going through some sort of behavioural issue. But there was one day when a marsh harrier appeared, and for about 10 minutes it was constantly diving into what we thought was the nest site, coming in, coming out. Hearts were in our mouths, because again at that point we hadn't seen anything, and after about 10 minutes it gave up and flew off. And I think that what that actually told us was that A, there were youngsters in there, and B, they were of a size that the marsh harrier couldn't get them, so it seemed to be all good news.
In the past they've had a checkered history and a lot of persecution, haven't they?
About 100 years ago, something like 200,000 of these birds were slaughtered every year in the States and also in Europe for fashion-conscious women, I suppose, in terms of the egrets that grow out the back, the plumes, were used for hats. And it was that slaughter that kicked off a lot of the RSPB's and the National Audubon Society's work. In fact, the great white egret is the emblem of the National Audubon Society in the States. And I think what's been happening since then is that over that last 100 years, the colonies that were down to lower numbers have started to recover. And I think what you're seeing here is that there's this fantastic habitat that is almost open to new birds coming in. The great white egrets have found it, have been spreading across from Europe, and are going to become established here.
Now, the great white egret practices asynchronous hatching, so you have chicks at various stages of development within a nest. So theoretically there could have been more than 3 in that nest.
The bird will lay up to about 6 eggs, so it is possible that there could have been more than 3 at the start, and there were some awful conditions when we were wardening in those first weeks. It is possible, because the bird is supposedly cannibalistic, so the younger chicks in that nest may have been eaten by the older ones, but 3 out of a nest for the UK is not bad going.
So after the excitement of the first nest and the first UK great white egrets breeding here, things changed. Suddenly you ended up with a second pair. Tell me what happened then, Kevin.
It was quite difficult in the early days, because we're watching the first nest and the youngsters coming and going, and the public were very, very focused on these youngsters. But we had half an eye on to the other side of the lake, where we'd been watching repeated activity, again a bit like the first time round, sticks and reeds going into one willow on the far side of the lake. So we were doing our best at that stage to keep the public's attention on the youngsters from the first nest, but we were keeping a second eye on the fact that it looked like a second nest was being built in the far corner of the lake. It was quite difficult in the early days, because we're watching the first nest and the youngsters coming and going, and the public were very, very focused on these youngsters. But we had half an eye on to the other side of the lake, where we'd been watching Repeated activity, again a bit like the first time round, sticks and reeds going into one willow on the far side of the lake. So we were doing our best at that stage to keep the public's attention on the youngsters from the first nest, but we were keeping a second eye on the fact that it looked like a second nest was being built in the far corner of the lake.
Well, it sounds as though you've had some fantastic help from the various groups helping protect and monitor this nest, and it's all done on their own volition and without pay, Kevin, is that right?
We've had about 40 volunteers all told over, and it's almost 2.5 months that we've been watching this. And those volunteers, yes, totally unpaid, here all times of day and night in some absolutely horrendous weather conditions at times. And I think from everybody at Natural England, the RSPB, we need to say a huge thank you to those volunteers.
What stage are we at with the second nest at the moment?
Well, we've already seen this morning that there are 2 chicks in that nest getting fed, and we've seen some incredible activity already with feeding by the parent. 2 very large chicks, one slightly larger than the other, but they look very healthy. They're already up and stretching their wings, and I don't think it's going to be long before we see flight feathers appearing, and they're going to be hopping around the nest as well.
Okay, so we've arrived at the nest site. What's been going on this morning, Kevin?
Well, we've already seen a changeover. The adult's been in, and they've both been standing on that willow bush, and we saw some cracking shots of them feeding, and then one of the chicks came up the nest, and I think we were all incredibly surprised by the size of the thing now.
I think it's important to say that as well as great white egrets, we've got some other star species here, Kevin. What have we got at Shapwick NNR?
Just a few moments ago we saw a bittern lifting up and going around the reserve, and they are here in big numbers now. Marsh harriers are out there, and if you're really lucky you could see an otter. And also today we've seen lots of hobbies hunting the dragonflies, so all told this is a great place to visit. Chick's starting to move below it at the moment, just where the adult's sitting on the left. There's a chick to its bottom right. You just see some grey fluffy feathers.
Now, members of the public are obviously going to be keen to come and see these egrets. Is there any advice that you can give those guys that want to come and have a look?
Yes, we do have to respect the local residents here. The parking isn't great. If you do want to come and visit, the best place to go is the Avalon Marshes Centre, and the postcode for that is BA6 9TT. And there are instructions there at the Avalon Marshes Centre where to come and find the nest here. It's feeding it now.
So we've got 2 chicks in the nest at the moment. How old are they and how long before they fledge?
Well, the eldest one should be about 3 weeks, and that's probably about 3 weeks today. The other one's probably a couple of days behind it. We believe within about 2 weeks we're going to see those chicks right up on the side of the nest getting ready to go. And if it's anything like the first time, it's difficult to say what fledging is with these, because they tend to flap around, leave the nest, come back, and they'll do that for quite some time before they completely leave the nest and they're independent from the adults.
Well, we've had a cracking time here at Shapwick Heath National Nature Reserve. We've had hobbies, bitterns, and of course the great white egrets. So thanks to Kevin for joining me this morning, and let's hope these birds go on to form a viable population here in the UK.